It is said that time and tide wait for no man. But the painter, well, the painter waits for both. Mikey Doyle steered a boat into the swell of a brooding ocean, leaving the safety of Harbour walls. This is too early, he thought with a yawn. Perhaps he was right. Even for commercial fishermen, this was early. But despite the storm warnings, Mikey had a haul to secure. He was not fishing, though, nor crab or lobster, but a haul nevertheless. 3 miles down the coast from the tourist-rich sea harbor of Port Maven would be a lonely marker buoy that, while only being a yellow ball of beaten plastic, held the answer to Mikey's hopes and dreams. Because attached to that buoy was a line to a waterproof parcel the size of a beer crate, the contents of which would have a street value of $1.5 million once it was cut, divided, and subdivided again. Mikey, of course, wouldn't be getting all that, but he was still getting a good payday for his part, enough to clear his debts, and then some. His car payments had slipped, and he had been ducking his landlord for the last 2 months. Then there was the new one, child support. He knew he had a daughter called Rose. He'd only seen her once, and that had been by accident at a country pub 6 years ago. She had just turned 3. He had ghosted the mother from the start, choosing not to get involved. Mikey had never worked a day in his life, not that the taxman knew of, not until getting a job doing event security last summer. Then, with his second paycheck, he got a weighty demand from the government welfare. He'd claimed the kid wasn't his, right up until the DNA test results came back. She was. Now he stared absently at the sea, where miniature white horses broke on rolling wave tops, barely illuminated in the darkness. The stars were nowhere to be seen tonight, hidden behind a veil of cloud that only allowed for glimpses of moonlight. Sea spray would occasionally burst from the prow, soaking his face and stinging his eyes if he dared step out of the cabin. There was only one debt he couldn't pay, and that was to do with the boat he stood on. The boat wasn't actually his. It belonged to Jim Lunkin, Mikey's best friend, or rather, he had been. No matter how much you want to make things right, it's so much harder when that person is dead. The locals had noticed Jim's sudden absence, guessing he'd gone visiting family in the north, and that they'd see him again in a few weeks. Mikey knew that wasn't the case. He knew that Jim wouldn't be showing up with a smile and a six-pack. He knew Jim wouldn't be making a surprise appearance on karaoke down at the Lighthouse Inn. Mikey knew the list of things Jim wouldn't be doing was endless because Jim had been hacked into several pieces and dumped in the ocean 5 miles offshore. Mikey wished he'd never brought Jim into his dealings, but he needed a boat quickly, and drug runners were not known for patience. Mikey had been out of time, but on that fatal night, Mikey had been accompanied by men higher up the food chain, and the delivery had been more than a well-wrapped parcel. Clinging to the buoy were 2 Vietnamese girls. He guessed they were Vietnamese. When did he know? They were wearing life jackets which barely held their heads out of the water. They couldn't have been any older than 18. When Mikey got back to the harbor, Jim had been there. Jim was already getting cold feet about the parcel, so when he saw 2 girls being pulled from his boat and manhandled into the back of a van, he pretty much lost his shit. It was morally the correct reason, Mikey thought, but it didn't make it a clever one. Mikey had said nothing. He kept his mouth shut when the girls went in the van. He kept his mouth shut when Jim spoke out on the harbor. he kept his mouth shut when they shot Jim in the head. He even kept his mouth shut when they dragged Jim, his best friend of 9 years, back on the boat and began cutting him up. Mikey always looked out for number one before anything else. The world just made more sense to him that way. What really pissed Mikey off was that the thing with Jim had gotten the dealer so riled up, they didn't pay him. They told him he was lucky he hadn't been shot in the head himself for bringing in a fuck-up like Jim, who could have ruined the whole setup. Mikey said nothing. He throttled down as he approached the marker, leaving the engine to idle. Grabbing a boat hook, he began dragging the buoy to him. Easy money, he thought. It took another 10 minutes to secure the package, hoisting it up from the seabed, using the winch mounted at the rear of the boat. He scanned around frequently, looking for the telltale lights piercing the darkness. Meanwhile, the wind had continued to pick up, starting to howl as the swell of the waves grew. He was now struggling to stand, but the pickup was done. Nothing to do but head home and get paid. The first mile back was rough, riding a growing swell, feeling the prow rise and fall. But the next mile was about to get much worse. The hull almost left the water at times, slamming down again and again after each wave. What wasn't lashed down got tossed about like dice in a gambler's cup. Mikey braced himself in the small cabin, both hands gripping at the wheel. He was sure he'd encountered worse conditions, but nothing sprang to mind. He glanced over his shoulder to check the parcel, lashed down at the stern. That, at least, wasn't going anywhere. He was only a mile out from the harbor that it happened. Mikey was out of breath, not being an experienced or qualified seaman. As the conditions worsened, he remembered something about letting your boat lie ahull, which is to let it take its own position in the sea whilst trying to keep the bow in the wind. He had remembered that because it reminded him of his own life. Just keep going with the flow. What Mikey didn't know was that while it's an okay tactic in moderate to severe gales, there became a point when it wasn't, and if you stick with it, you risk getting capsized. The boat twisted atop of what was surely the largest wave yet. Mikey could see the flash of the lighthouse, but that wasn't going to help him any. As he landed broadside into the next tower of water, the whole boat tilted beyond 90 degrees, throwing him off the wheel and against the wall, bouncing his skull on the metal doorway. Suddenly, everything snapped to black. He awoke in a confused haze. The light of day was now filtered through a gray, miserable fog. The only sound from the chugging of the inboard engine, barely ticking over. He lay on the deck, his face resting in the damp, tasting blood in his mouth and salt on his lips, reveled at no longer being battered by the ocean. It was still. Calm. Quiet. Getting to his feet, the first thing he did was check the parcel. It was still there, the sealed plastic block secure in its place. He breathed a sigh of relief before looking around to get his bearings. Mikey couldn't believe his luck. Only yards ahead of him, made out of the harbor wall and the lighthouse, together they stood out in the mist, two distinct and familiar silhouettes, silent guardians thrust into a graying sky. He didn't know how long he'd been out for. Figured he must have gotten all turned around, but letting the boat do its own thing had worked out for him in the long run. It almost seemed as if someone up there had been watching out for him. He banged his fist on the rail with excitement. "Fucking yes, Mikey!" he shouted. Man, he was happy to be alive. "Fucking yes!" Swinging the wheel, he headed into the harbor with a grinning face. That was when he noticed it. the paint. For hundreds of feet, the harbor's stone walls had been covered in it. So had the lighthouse, even the glass where the light shone. It was thick and crudely applied. A million drips ran through it, making it seem alive and breathing. Black paint. Not a black you would choose from a color chart, or paint a chalkboard with, but black stolen from the primordial void. Black imbued with dark patience that promised to outweigh the light. He looked around, thinking to himself how pissed the harbor master was going to be as he stared through the fog at the other boats moored up. Everyone, it seemed, had been painted. Every single one. From the skiffs to the giant trawlers, even the glass-bottom boats for tourists, every inch was covered. But it didn't stop there. The mooring ropes, too. They glistened in the black ooze, as did the anchor chains running down into the river. The marker buoys and the flagpoles, including the flag itself, was painted beyond recognition, and they all dripped with the same heavy black. As he drifted slowly through the outer harbor, the fog cleared away. He expected to see a lot of seriously pissed off people. Especially the harbor master's name was eluded him for the moment. He was a stickler for the rules, or a real prick, as Mikey often liked to say. He expected to see a hive of outrage and indignation any moment now. Any moment. Nobody. No one. He should have been seeing vans coming and going, forklifts hoisting crates, tourists drinking coffee, and fishermen exchanging banter. That's when the silence hit him. Other than the soft lapping of the ocean, there was nothing else. Where are the damn gulls? He thought. There were always gulls crying at the harbor. Their persistent screeching was almost part of the landscape. Where are the gulls? The inner harbor didn't hold any answers, though, only more questions, as every building on the harbor front was coated in darkness. He stared in disbelief at the ice cream shop, the visitors' museum, his favorite restaurant. Not an inch had been spared, the windows and doors, the gutters and lights. All he could make out was little more than a memory of form and thick black paint. In every direction he looked, the paint had spread out, a dark cancer growing in the heart of the village. His first thought was that he was the victim of some practical joke, but he discounted the idea almost immediately. This was too much work. Too much trouble. Maybe then it was a set for a movie or a TV crew. Sometimes the harbor was used as a filming location, but the more he thought about it, the less likely it seemed. Where were the film crew? The catering? Security? Why hadn't he heard about it? Everything had looked picture perfect when he had set aboard earlier. He shook his head and moored up, tying off an anchor point covered in the same black paint. It didn't smell like paint. Didn't really smell of anything, perhaps a little musty. It made him think of decay. He made a point of not touching it and headed into the back streets. That's when he first heard it. Laughter. An innocent ripple of a child's joy. Just for a second. He looked for the source of the laughter, but couldn't figure a direction. Increasingly concerned, he turned up a narrow street where even the cobblestones under his feet were painted black. He didn't like the way it felt when he walked on them, instantly regretting taking the shortcut towards the lighthouse inn. But someone would be there for sure, he thought. There's always someone there. Then he saw two things that stopped him dead in his tracks. Two things he knew instantly were connected. Two things that couldn't be. The first was a figure, tall and hooded, covered in folds of black cloth, soaking wet with dripping black paint. It carried an ancient-looking bucket in a long-fingered translucent hand and a wide, oversized brush in its other. It was silently painting a building in single strokes, its arm extended impossibly ever longer to reach the rooftop as it did, where its face should have been. There was nothing. The second thing Mikey saw was a man. Just a normal man cowering in the shadow of a doorway behind the dark painter. The painter hadn't appeared to notice him yet. It was this normal man who terrified Mikey more than the supernatural painter. It was his best friend, Jim. Jim Lunkin. Jim, who was chopped into several different pieces on the ocean floor. I'm sorry, Mikey said softly, hardly aware he'd spoken. Jim cringed, his body hunkering down as he put a finger to his lips, begging for silence. But the words had been spoken. Slowly, as if in a rotating pedestal, the painter turned to face Jim, who now abandoned his hiding place with a shout of, "Run!" He sprinted towards Mikey. Jim was always fast. He was almost beside him before Mikey knew it. Mikey was beginning to turn when the painter's arms extended impossibly fast. The painter hadn't moved, only its arms had impossibly lengthened. The entire distance that Jim had covered, the painter's long fingers grasped Jim's entire head, gripping it like a spider seizing its prey. As the painter glided closer with a dripping brush, Mikey staggered in shock. He tried to yell, but his voice choked on the fear that was stuck in his throat. The painter held Jim in place, despite his kicking and screaming. Jim grabbed the long bony finger, twisting in their grip, but to no avail. The painter began to paint a long stroke up Jim's right leg and torso. More screaming as Jim struggled, his eyes bulged, straining wide with exertion. Each brushstroke began turning Jim Lunkin's flesh into paint itself. It dripped down to the floor as, drop by drop, Jim was painted out of existence. It saved his head for last, and when that was all that was left of him, when there were no lungs to scream from, the painter held it up and slowly painted out Jim's face, pressing the brush deep into eye sockets and working the brush into Jim's still chomping mouth with a cold indifference. When there was nothing but the tattered rags of Jim's clothes, it worked on them too, wringing them out until they turned to wet globs of paint, slipping through the inhuman hands, dripping to the ground. Mikey was frozen, condemned to watch the horror of Jim's death for a second time. His paralysis only ended when the painter turned his attention towards him. He fled, praying the long arm wouldn't reach him next. Mikey ran faster than he thought possible. His heart pounded furiously, fueled by the adrenaline of fear. His muscles screamed as he raced up the hill on Main Street, passing the black shops and houses to arrive at the Lighthouse Inn. This was the only building yet to retain some of its original character, the paint having stopped mid-stroke before the yawning entrance. The colors were a welcome relief as he stepped inside. Mikey found himself appreciating the well-worn crimson upholstery and the shabby red, beer-stained carpet in the way he wouldn't have believed possible until now. It stood out in stark relief to the world outside. The place was always well attended, though, and he felt he'd be sure to find someone here to explain what the hell was happening. Inside, though, it seemed abandoned. He tried to recall who he should be seeing, but sweating and panting still from his exertions, he couldn't bring any names to mind. Only old Bill, who could always be found seated on the table stool around the corner of the bar by the pool table. He was there so often, he was almost part of the furniture. Sure enough, Bill was sat in his usual spot, back to the wall, but no one else. "Bill!" Mikey shouted. Bill didn't seem at all concerned, but then Mikey remembered Bill never did. Bill had taught at some fancy university for years. Mikey reasoned such people developed a certain approach to life. "Jesus, Bill, what the hell's going on?" "Nothing anymore," Bill replied, lifting a pint in acknowledgement. "Nothing since the painters." "What do you mean?" Mikey said, looking around the empty bar. "What's happened? I don't understand." "Don't you?" Bill replied. "No, I fucking well don't." "You want answers?" Bill dangled the question out, infuriatingly. Mike had talked to Bill more than a few times, normally towards the end of the night. Though he'd never said it out loud, Bill was the smartest person Mikey had ever talked to. He seemed to know a little about everything and a lot about the stuff of which most people knew nothing. "Painters? Are you telling me there's more of them?" Mikey asked, finding his breath had returned. "I just escaped from one of those things near the harbor. It was so black, and its arm..." Mikey choked, trying not to recall the encounter. "What the hell are they?" he asked, desperate for some kind of answer that would explain the madness away. "I can spare you a couple minutes, I suppose," Bill continued. "I don't know about anything with certainty, but I can talk about the possibilities of what they could be. First thing you might want to consider is, are we awake? Is this real? Perhaps this is just a terrible nightmare you're just about to wake up from." "Look, I'm not dreaming any of this bullshit," Mikey answered. "All right, so we can discount that if you're sure," Bill replied. "Secondly, perhaps when you banged your head, you've been injured. All this is your dying brain running out of oxygen. Painters are some manifestation of guilt you were feeling, conjured up by your cerebral cortex. Maybe not quite a dream." Mike put his hand up to the lump on his head from where he had hit it in the doorway. It stung. He could feel the swelling and dried blood. "No, that's not it, Bill. I'm here. This is real. Please, not another one of your how do you know what's real lectures. I'm far too fucking sober for that shit right now." "Well, this is the third thing," said Bill. "I promise you won't like it." "Try me," Mikey replied, leaning over the bar and helping himself to a bottle of whiskey, swigging straight from the bottle. "You're out of time," answered Bill. "What do you mean? We just started talking." "No, you're out of time. Time's moved on. You've been left behind or pulled from it. And where we are now, well, this space left in its wake. It's all the shadow of a moment past, Mikey, and the painters are obliterating it. And when their work is done here, there'll be nothing. No memory of you, no me, no nothing." "Bullshit." "Well, it's just a hypothesis," Bill replied with an easy smile. "This is typical of you, Bill. Every time we talk, you always do this. It's messing my head." Mikey cried, burying his head into his hands. "Every time we talk, this is what I do, right?" "Every time, man," Mikey answered. "Well, that's the problem here, Mikey. You remember this place well, you spend a lot of time here, you always see me in the corner." "Yeah, so what?" Mikey answered. But a chill had begun to form down his spine, as some part of him already knew what Bill was going to say next. "And you think I'm smart? Smartest man you ever met." "Well, I never said..." Mikey's voice began to fade. "If I'm so smart, then why can't I remember what I had for breakfast this morning, or where I live, where I grew up?" Stop it, Bill. You already know the answer, Bill replied. I know I drank craft ale. I know I'm smart, but I don't know any details of my life. I don't know what the inside of my house looks like, or where I got married, or if I have children. I have no knowledge of my life at all. And you know why? Stop it, Bill, Mikey whined. You know, stop. Bill took a long swig of his drink before he put the glass back down. I'm just a memory, Mikey. I'm just your memory of Bill. No! Mikey shouted, backing away and shaking his head. You know it's true, Bill said. They're coming for you. They paint everything that ever was. People go fast. Buildings take longer. The more permanent something has, the longer it takes, but everything gets painted. Sooner or later, Mikey, everything gets painted black. Mikey didn't say anything. You're out of time, said Bill. So am I. He got off his stool and made towards the door. As he did, a monstrous black figure rose silently from behind the bar, its arm dripping with paint already extending. Mikey saw the brush smear across Bill's back. And again, Mikey ran. All he could think of was getting back to the safety of the boat. Running downhill was harder. More than once, he almost lost his balance. He could see other painters now. Some watched on from the rooftops. Others he glimpsed through the streets, gliding effortlessly. They matched his frantic pace as he made his approach to the harbor. He was so close now. It was only the laughter that stopped him. A child's laughter. A young girl ran into his path, almost colliding. She was tiny, no more than 3 years old, wearing a yellow hooded jacket. You can't be here, honey. Where are your folks? Mikey said, speaking as quickly as he could. No, my dad, said the girl, pulling back her hood. Mikey stared straight into the face of the daughter he had only seen once. But Rose must be almost 10 by now. This couldn't be her. I don't know, my dad. She said it again. The words hit him in the gut, just as he realized the yellow coat was what she was wearing the only time he'd ever seen her 6 years ago. He saw a movement from the corner of his eye. The painters were looming within grabbing distance. Several of them now converged on him and Rose, their cowls dripping paint as they advanced. He grabbed the girl's hand to pull her with him, but his hand just passed through hers as if she wasn't quite there. He tried again frantically, and again. I don't know, my dad, she said. She was saying it repeatedly now, staring through him as Mikey's face became a mask of dread and despair. The painters approached the last memory of his daughter like grotesque shadows, their brushes raised. She looked so small. She didn't have time to scream. Then there was only paint and darkness, and Mikey could remember her no longer. Mikey didn't remember making it back to the boat. Tears were falling from his eyes, but he didn't know why. He gunned the engine, heading for the mouth of the harbor and the promise of open sea. But with every yard, he sailed closer to escape. Another dark figure appeared, until hundreds of painters stood in silence, lining the harbor walls, watching and waiting. Mikey forced himself to look away, his eyes feral. His mind fought a losing battle to recollect anything at all, other than the bile of his own fear. The painter's work was almost done. They never rushed. They were always out of time. Standing shoulder to shoulder, they raised their buckets, and with perfect synchronization, began pouring the content into the ocean. The paint spewed forth without stopping. Endless millions of black gallons flowed until the water changed from hues of blue to an endless black. It spread out, pushing forward to make an entire sea of paint, where time and memory no longer existed. What had once been a man on a boat staring at the black waves, he looked down to see his translucent, skeletal fingers now held a dark, dripping brush. He would say nothing. He would paint. Hey guys, do you know I made a video game? So, Megabyte Games is me and General Drowned, and we're trying to make a couple video games together. If you guys would like to see what games those are, check out Midnight Myths. It's on my itch.io, MrCreepyPasta.itch.io. If you want to download the game, it's free, and you can check it out for yourself and let me know what you think. As always, I want to give a very big thank you to everybody out there on patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. You guys are honestly a lifesaver when it comes down to this. I feel like a lot of stresses in my life kind of have been leading me to pulling my hair out, but you guys giving me support has been immense for me. So I want to say a big thank you to everybody that's on there, even if you can only donate $1. Hey, you guys are keeping me alive at this point. So a very, very big thank you to everybody there, and to especially Jordan Humble, Diana Kraus, King Crab, Calcifer 420, Veronica Lynn Lopez, Marlon Chavez, Azazel 66603, Ethan Leon, Polaris Prospect X, Blake Rattler, Viceroy Scorn, Samara Lynn, Disciple, SullyMan, Brandon Mendoza, BrimstonePandemonium, Caltuna, William Wellington, Scruffy the Janitor, Brenna Crow, LaQueda, Canizales, Smiley the Psychotic, Dante Kinkade, SimbasBloodyMojo, CursepoxPrimarch, M, Jenna's Pet, Clonable, J Kearns, Mike, himbojerry, CrusaderChocobo, Remember the Sun, Estebean, Hour Minute Second Time, Seclude, Salty Surprise, Red Shadowcat, Turtleman, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Voice of Sand, Ficomel, Melted Lake, Tully Sue, Proconut 509, Stricken, Freddy Krueger, Hades Nephew, Tommy Walters, Acid System, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, Tristan Pelkin, Ball Arms the Rat, The Ginger Bros, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kinchin. To all of you guys there, everybody who's down in the description, and everybody who can just give $1, I want to say thank you to you guys. And if you would like to join this list in the description, head over to patreon.com/MrCreepy. And if you would like to join this list in the description, sweet dreams.